There's an old saying in the small town of Daring, tucked deep in the Appalachian foothills, where the mist hangs thick in the mornings and the nights are so quiet, they seem to hold their breath. The saying goes like this: everything's a bargain until the price of your soul is paid. And if you ask the locals, they'll tell you this tale to explain it all. The story of Jacob Holloway, the man who bought a house for $1 and paid the price in ways no one could have foreseen. Jacob was a young man, ambitious, curious, and full of the kind of reckless hope that only someone who has never lived through hardship can have. He had just returned to Daring after many years away. The city life had worn him thin, and his inheritance from his late uncle, a wealthy man who had made his fortune from mining, left him with enough to make a fresh start. He heard of the house through whispers at the local bar, where the old men sat in the shadows and smoked their pipes, their stories colored with that dry, earthy drawl that made you question whether they were telling the truth or just another one of their tall tales. It's been empty for years, they said, and I wouldn't go near it for all the gold in the valley. They say the house has a price, but not one that money can pay. Jacob, of course, didn't believe in old superstitions. He had been raised on the promise that hard work and ambition could break through any curse, outsmart any ghost. He was a man of logic, and the idea of a haunted house was laughable to him. So when he heard that the place had been put up for sale, the house known as Holloway Manor, named after his ancestors no less, he wasted no time. He went straight to the real estate office, where the old agent, a nervous woman with graying hair, handed him the keys without hesitation. She didn't say much, just a few words that Jacob thought were odd, but he brushed them off. "Take care of it, Mr. Holloway. The house has its own way of doing things. You'll see." The house stood on the edge of the town, a looming presence on a hill surrounded by a thick, unbroken forest. Its stone walls were dark with age, its windows darkened with dirt, and the once grand front porch had long since been overtaken by creeping vines. The townsfolk avoided the place, giving it a wide berth, as if they could feel the weight of its history without ever stepping foot inside. But Jacob was undeterred. He stood in front of the gate, clutching the rusty key that he had just acquired, feeling the weight of the dollar he'd paid for it. The sign by the gate, now almost unreadable with time, had a strange and archaic inscription: "The price is not what you pay but what you owe." He couldn't help but laugh. This place is mine now. The first few days were uneventful. Jacob spent his time cleaning and fixing the house, trying to restore it to its former glory. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the odd creaks and groans of the house. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, he thought he heard footsteps upstairs when no one else was around. But he chalked it up to the wind, the house settling into itself. However, the deeper Jacob went into the house, the stranger things became. The cellar was a maze of dusty old crates and broken furniture, and when he opened the door to the attic, an overwhelming sense of unease washed over him. The air was thick, musty, and still, and there were old paintings of people he didn't recognize, their eyes following him with a sort of unspoken sorrow. There was one portrait in particular that caught his attention, a young woman with pale skin and dark eyes. She looked so familiar, yet Jacob was sure he had never seen her before. He stared at the painting for what felt like hours, and in the silence he began to hear something faint, almost a whisper, like someone calling his name. "Jacob?" He spun around, his heart racing, but the room was empty. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He had to be imagining things. It had been a long day of cleaning and working. But as the days passed, things started to get stranger. He would leave the house for a few hours, only to return and find things moved. Furniture slightly shifted, doors that were once closed now ajar. And sometimes, in the corners of the rooms, there was the faintest hint of a smell, a flowery scent like roses in bloom. But when Jacob checked, the roses were nowhere to be found. One night, while sitting by the fireplace, Jacob noticed something even stranger. The clock on the mantel, which had been silent for as long as he could remember, began to tick, the sound loud in the otherwise quiet room. He watched as the minute hand slowly ticked forward, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he felt the weight of the house, its history, pressed down on him. It was then that he heard the voice again. "Jacob?" This time it was clearer. "Closer." Jacob's blood ran cold. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor as he turned toward the source of the voice. His heart hammered in his chest. And then, from the shadows by the staircase, a figure appeared. It was the woman from the portrait. She stood there in a long, dark dress, her face pale and gaunt, her dark eyes fixed on him. Her lips were parted as if she was about to speak, but no words came out. The air around her seemed to shimmer, her presence pulling at the edges of the room like some invisible force. "Oh, who are you?" Jacob stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she began to move closer, her feet silent on the floorboards as though she was floating. And with each step, Jacob could feel the temperature drop, a chill so cold it sunk into his very bones. "I took it," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Jacob's heart raced. He took a step back, his mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. Was it real? Was he dreaming? "What did I take?" Jacob demanded, his voice growing louder. "What do you want from me?" The woman's eyes darkened, her gaze sharpening as if cutting through him. She reached out, her hand trembling, but as she did, the entire room seemed to tremble with her. "You took what wasn't yours to have," she said, her voice colder now, like a warning from the deepest winter. "The price has been set." With those words, the temperature dropped even further, until Jacob could see his breath in the air. He turned to run, but the house seemed to shift around him, the hallways stretching out, the doors growing further away. The woman's laughter echoed in the cold, empty space. It was a sound that chilled Jacob's very soul. And that was the moment he understood. The house was alive, alive with a curse as old as the land itself, and no matter how hard he tried, he could never leave. Not now. Not after he had paid the price. The house had claimed him just as it had claimed so many before him. Jacob's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as he stumbled through the darkened halls of Holloway Manor. The laughter of the woman, the one from the portrait, still echoed in his ears, a cold and hollow sound that seemed to seep into his very bones. Each step he took only led him deeper into the labyrinth of the house, as if the walls themselves were shifting and twisting, denying him the chance to escape.
He turned this way and that, his heart pounding in his throat. The house had become an unrecognizable maze, each hallway more unfamiliar than the last. No matter how many times he tried to reach for the front door, it seemed to move further away. The woman's cold, hollow eyes haunted his mind. "The price has been set," she had said. But what did that mean? What price was she talking about? What did he owe the house, this cursed place? He stumbled into a small, dimly lit room, one he hadn't seen before. The floorboards creaked beneath him, and the walls, lined with dusty old bookshelves, seemed to close in on him as the silence deepened. Jacob's eyes darted to the far corner of the room, where a small table sat with a flickering candle burning softly in the middle. On the table lay a small, intricately carved box. Its surface was worn with age, the wood dark and cracked, but there was an odd, inviting glow about it. Jacob felt a pull toward the box, a magnetic force that drew him in despite his better judgment. His fingers trembled as he reached out and touched the cold wood. Before he could open it, the air around him thickened, as if the very house was holding its breath. And then he heard it again, the whisper. The woman's voice, low and chilling. "Open it!" she commanded, the words barely audible. Against his better instincts, Jacob lifted the lid of the box. Inside was an old, yellowed letter sealed with a crimson wax that looked strangely fresh. The wax seemed to glisten in the flickering candlelight, as if it had been placed there only moments ago. Jacob's heart raced as he unfolded the letter, the handwriting spidery and ancient, the ink faded but legible. "To the one who claims what is not his own, you must understand that no treasure comes without its cost. You may hold the house in your name, but the house will not forget. The price will always be paid. Once you enter its doors, the debt begins. And the debt will never be paid until you give what is truly yours." Jacob's hands shook as he read the words. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The letter didn't make sense. What was the debt? What had he taken from the house? A cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candle in an instant. The darkness felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides, and Jacob felt a growing weight on his chest. He could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway. He spun around, heart pounding in his chest. The woman from the portrait stood there, her face pale and her eyes lifeless, watching him. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Jacob could see his breath fogging in the air. "You took it," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You took what should not have been taken. And now you belong to the house." Jacob opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His mind was racing, and he could feel the pull of something darker, something ancient, calling to him from within the very walls of Holloway Manor. "You cannot leave," the woman continued, her voice a rasping echo. "The house has chosen you. You will never escape. The dead is yours now. The house demands its due." The walls seemed to shudder, the very foundation of the house groaning under the weight of its curse. Jacob's knees buckled as he dropped to the floor, his head spinning. His hand clenched around the letter, the words blurred by his panic. "Please," he gasped, his voice breaking. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The woman's cold smile never faltered. "The price of the house is paid in blood," she said. "The blood of those who seek to own it." Jacob felt his stomach turn, a sickening realization settling in. Blood. Was she talking about a sacrifice? Was it his blood that the house craved? Had he made a deal without even knowing it? He turned toward the door, his mind screaming for him to run, but as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the very walls. The room grew colder still, the shadows stretching longer, and the whispers in the air grew louder, as if the very house was alive with the voices of the dead. "No," Jacob whispered, backing away. "I won't do it. I'll leave. I'll pay whatever price you want, but I won't." "You have no choice," the woman interrupted, her voice low and dangerous. "You already paid. You took what was never yours. The house claimed you the moment you stepped inside." Suddenly, the floor beneath Jacob's feet gave way. He fell, his hands flailing to grab hold of something, anything, to stop the descent. The walls seemed to close in around him as he tumbled through darkness, the air thick and suffocating. With a jarring crash, Jacob hit the ground. He was no longer in the room. The walls were gone. The house, the woman, everything was gone. He was standing in a vast, empty space. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed around him. Then, from the shadows, something moved. A figure emerged, tall, skeletal, and draped in tattered clothes. Its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers, and its mouth opened wide in a grimace. It was a man, but not a man anymore. It was a thing, something twisted, broken, and long dead. "The price," the figure rasped, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "The house always collects. And now you will give what it demands." Jacob stumbled back, his breath quickening. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. But as the figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes locking onto his, Jacob felt the weight of his fate crushing him. The house had claimed him, and there was no escaping the debt. The figure reached out, its cold, bony hand brushing Jacob's arm. A chill shot through him, freezing him to the core. He screamed, but no sound came. Only the eerie silence of Holloway Manor answered. Jacob's heart thundered in his chest as the skeletal figure closed in on him, its bony fingers reaching toward him with an unrelenting grip. The chill of its touch seemed to seep deep into his skin, like the frost creeping through the bones of a dying tree. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body was frozen, immobile, as though the very air around him had turned to ice. "You thought you could escape," the figure rasped, its voice an eerie echo of the dead. "You thought the price was a joke. But the house, it never forgets." Jacob could feel the weight of its words pressing down on him, suffocating him. The house had been waiting for him. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, and he tried to pull away, but it was useless. The shadows seemed to cling to him, pulling him deeper into the heart of the house, into the very darkness that had claimed so many before him. "What do you want from me?" Jacob managed to force out, his voice raw and desperate. "What do you need?" I'll give you anything. Please." The skeletal figure chuckled darkly, the sound like the rattling of dry bones. "Anything?" it mocked. "You've already given everything. Your soul, your future. The house never asks for more than what it's owed. You should have known." Suddenly, Jacob's vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to twist and distort. The walls of the house, no, the entire space, began to shift like a nightmare unfolding before his eyes. The floor seemed to buckle beneath him, and in the distance, he could hear whispers, thousands of whispers, all calling out his name. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, the weight of the curse sinking in with every passing second. From the shadows, the woman from the portrait appeared again, her gaunt, ghostly figure standing like a sentinel in the darkness. Her eyes gleamed with a cruel light, and her lips twisted into a twisted, cold smile. "It was never a house you bought," she said, her voice cold and distant. "It was a prison. And now you're trapped inside it. All who come here pay a price, and for you, Jacob Holloway, the price is not gold, nor land, nor riches. It is everything you are. Your life. Your soul. Your future." Jacob wanted to protest, wanted to shout that he didn't deserve this, that it wasn't fair, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of the curse of Holloway Manor, pressed on him like a heavy stone, pushing him deeper into despair. The house, it had always been alive. It had always fed on the souls of those foolish enough to think they could escape its grasp. The figure, no longer just a man, but a thing of pure darkness, stepped closer, its bony fingers stretching toward Jacob's chest. He could feel the chill of its touch, colder than the depths of winter. He gasped, his vision swimming with an oppressive darkness, and the words of the letter, "The price will never be paid until you give what is truly yours," rung in his mind like the tolling of a bell. But just as the figure's hand was about to reach him, a voice, his own voice, cried out from the deepest part of his soul. No. He would not give in. He would not let this cursed place claim him completely. And in that moment, something inside Jacob shifted. Something that had been buried deep within him for years. His ancestors, his family, had always believed in the old stories, in the curses, in the power of the land. And Jacob, in his blind ambition, had ignored it all. But now he understood. The house had taken so much from him already. His family had built it, paid the price long ago. He was the last of the Holloways, the last to stand here, and he knew now what he had to do. His hands trembled as he reached for the pendant around his neck, a family heirloom, passed down through generations. The metal was warm against his skin, a stark contrast to the chill that surrounded him. As his fingers brushed against it, he could feel a power surge within him, an ancient power, long buried by time and forgotten by his family. The whispers, the shadows, they all seemed to pause, as though they were waiting for him to make his choice. With a force of will he didn't know he possessed, Jacob stood up. The figure recoiled, its skeletal hands stopping just short of his chest. The woman's smile faltered as she looked at him, and for the first time, Jacob saw fear in her eyes. "You think you can escape?" the woman hissed, but there was a tremor in her voice. "You think you can change the price?" Jacob held the pendant tightly in his hand, and for the first time, he understood the power of his ancestors. The house, the curse, it had all been a cycle, passed down from one generation to the next. But that cycle could be broken. "I don't need to escape," Jacob said, his voice steady. "I need to end this." And with that, he thrust the pendant into the heart of the house, into the shadows, into the very core of the darkness that had taken so much from him. The moment the pendant touched the ground, a shockwave of energy rippled through the room. The house groaned and trembled, the walls shaking as if they were coming apart. For a brief moment, the darkness seemed to scream, a terrible, guttural sound that reverberated through the walls. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the house fell silent. Jacob collapsed to his knees, exhausted but alive. The house had stopped. The curse had broken. But as he sat there, breathing in the silence, something strange began to happen. The woman, the ghost, vanished, her figure dissipating into the air like smoke. And the skeletal figure, once towering and terrifying, faded away into the shadows. It was over. But was it really? Jacob stood up, his legs shaky but determined. The house, once so oppressive and alive with the curse of his ancestors, was now quiet. The oppressive weight that had filled the halls for generations was gone. But as Jacob stood in the center of the now empty manor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The price, after all, had never truly been paid. What had he given up? What had the house taken from him that he might never get back? The wind picked up outside, rustling the trees and shaking the branches, as though the house itself was whispering a warning to him. The house had been silent, but that didn't mean the curse was truly broken. Jacob Holloway had freed himself from the cycle. But deep down, in the quiet spaces of his heart, he knew he would never be the same. He had paid a price, and the cost, whatever it was, would follow him for the rest of his life. The man who had bought a house for $1 had learned that some bargains are too steep to ever pay off.